Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this panel discussion on Turkey's presidential system referendum that's coming up on April 16th. We have distinguished guests with us. We have a member of parliament from the AK party, Abdulhamit. He's a member of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. This is, I believe, his second term. He's a member of parliament from Gaziantep. As you know, Gaziantep is famous for hosting so many refugees from Syria. That's not going to be our topic today, but I just wanted to point that out. And for today's conversation, he's one of the critical names in this process of redrafting parts of the Constitution and proposing these constitutional amendments to move Turkey from the current hybrid system, actually, many would argue, to a presidential system. So he's been involved in the previous attempts at reforming and changing the Turkish constitution. In this most recent round, he's been in talks with not only MHP but also CHP as part of these negotiations to change the system. So I think he's going to contribute a great amount to our understanding of the nuances of this referendum. I think there's a lot of misinformation, and I have to admit I'm not as knowledgeable about certain parts of it as well. So I'm sure we will all benefit from this conversation. To his left, Mr. Gül's left, our own Nebi. He's the director of domestic policy program in Ankara of SETA Foundation. He's a scholar. He's written a whole book on this presidential system. He made comparisons. He's the most involved sort of academic think tank person in Turkey, one of the most, I should say. So we feel privileged to have him also. And of course, our own Kilic Kanat will be moderating this discussion. And I'm sure he's going to be able to allow us to sort of bring the debates in Turkey with the debates in America in a meaningful way. The conversation will proceed in Turkish, so please put your headphones on, those who don't understand Turkish. So that, again, I want to thank you all for coming, and Abdulhamit, thank you again for coming here. Please, thanks.
Transformation of the political system in Turkey. Okay, so when we look at the tradition of the parliamentary system in Turkey, why hasn't been in the last 40 years, with looking at all the parties that came into government, we have to pay attention to this. The parties that were ruling have always asked for a transformation of the political system. Because when we look at the 140 years of parliamentary tradition in Turkey, this has become a democratic system since 1950. But unfortunately, from 1950s on, the Turkish type parliamentarism has been established and has gone on in Turkey. Because when we look at the 50s to 60s, there's a democratization period. But unfortunately in Turkey there has been 6 times, there have been military coups or military coup attempts in 6 different occasions. In 4 times they have been successful and 2 of them have been unsuccessful. When we look at the ones that have been unsuccessful, it's about parties that had good leadership and good public support has faced military coups. Then if we look at the transformation of the political system in Turkey, the first bullet point should be that the tutelar system, parliamentary system in Turkey should change, and it's an opportunity to go over the points of conflict. What do I mean by tutelar parliamentary system? From 61 to 60, 71, 1997, 2007, and lastly 15th of July in 2016, in Turkey there has been military coups or military coup attempts. We know this. And just unfortunately, when we talk about deepening and institutionalizing democracy in Turkey, this has been prevented by these attempts. When we talk about deepening and institutionalization, some of the main reasons is every 10 years, the fact that there's a military coup attempt every 10 years, the political parties have been weakened by this, and they have struggled to institutionalize a democratic culture within the parties. And weak governments and weak parties meant that coalition periods in Turkey's both lost in democracy and lost in economic development. And there have been important crises in these. If we look at the Turkish democratic period from, let's start with 1923 by the foundation of the Republic, in the 93 years, there have been 65 different governments in power. The 65 governments, on average, when we look at how much they governed, we look at 16 months as an average. For example, if we look at in the 60s, 70s, and 90s, 60s, 70s, and 90s, when military coups came into being often, there were 10 different governments, and the 10 different governments, when we look at the formation of these governments, it's exceeded the 120 days of crisis and lack of governments. So we have to pay attention to this. If we look at the 1990s to 2000s, there has been 8 different governments in this period. Thus, look at tutelar military rule in Turkey, the coalition systems, the coalitions and the military tutelage has forced each other and meant that the people's power on the political system has been weakened. And this is an important thing we have to point out. When we look at this in Turkey, then from the 70s on, there have been important political actors who pointed out that the political system needs to be transformed. When did they start talking about this? In the 1970s, in the period of continuous coalitions and problems of governance. And in relation to this, when we look at the facts that deepen these crises, we look at that the presidency, the elections of the presidents have been problematic, especially after the 1960s. The presidential election and their role in the system meant that it was about ideological agreements, and it was based on a tutelar system, and it was to protect the tutelar nature of Turkish democracy. Thus, when we look at the election of presidents and the crises that were created by either retired soldiers or leaders of juntas, we know that the presidents came into power with their influence. And we look at this period, these processes, if we look at if the public, there were artificial crises created to prevent the public's effect on the selection of presidents. Let's give an example. In the 1980 military coup, in the process before that, there were 115 attempts to elect a president within the parliament, and they all failed. Following these attempts, the military coup took place. We know this. Therefore, from 1980 on, when we look at the arguments about transformation of the political system, it came to a debate where there should be a direct election of the presidency. Right now, if we look at the system where the parliament chooses the presidency, this this could be changed by direct election of the president by the people. And this was the expectation, and this is how the arguments came into being. And the most important of these crises was in 2007, the parliament, contrary to previous procedures, the, 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 the need for 367 MPs, the need for the presence of 367 MPs was cancelled. The rule was cancelled, and that there could be decorum with less. And there was an actor, Abdullah Gül, within the they tried to prevent by Abdullah Gül's selection, and the Constitutional Court made a decision in this direction, and they prevented from Abdullah Gül from being elected president. At this point, when we look at system crisis in Turkey, a new process came into being, and with the process meant that from 2007 on, this was the constitutional referendum meant that the people would be selecting the presidents. Within the parliamentary system, that was one of the important points of crisis. If we look at 1982 constitution, the power of the presidency was expanded, and just like a presidential system where the president has wide powers, the 1982 junta constitution meant that the president had wide range of powers. From 2007 on, with the election of the president by the people, when we look at that the government was elected by the people, we see that the system looks to clash between a government selected by the people and a president elected by the people. From Mr. Erdogan's election, especially when we look at today, both the parliament and Mr. Erdogan look at political tradition being the same between two sides. There's no large crisis, but after Mr. Erdogan, there's a possibility that we have to consider that there will be a crisis afterwards. So in the parliamentary system, the reason for all these discussions is this. And after these AKP and MHP's agreement meant that there was a new offer for a constitutional reform. I think it's my last 2 minutes. When we look at this crisis of the system, one of the most important points is, especially when we look at the tutelary parliamentary system that we had, is about the solution of the political system, and meant that certain political parties could be active in the system. They were allowed to be active in the system. What does this mean? It means that from 1961 Constitution on, if we look at it, the constitutional courts closed more than 25 parties. If we look at the military party system, they closed down the parliament, and they closed all the parties that were part of the democratic parties. So we have to point that out. Thus, if we look at all these different matters, the military tutelage needed to be ended in the system, and today's situation where it's a two-headed system, and when we look at the period of coalitions and the political instability that came with it, needs to be ended. This was the arguments for transforming the system into a presidential system. The process started. Maybe in the second part of my talk, I can talk about could they find solutions in the parliamentary system for these crises? Why is there a demand for transforming the system into a presidential system? Thank you. I want to say hello to all people, just like Mr. Nebi talked about. So the system in Turkey is not a parliamentary system. The current system came around after the 12th of September military coup. And this is what the coup members prepared for the people. And since the day that's 2001, since AKP was formed, it was always a democratic party asked for reform, and that's based governance on the will of the voters. And there have been many movements into developing democracy. Mr. Tayyip Erdogan, his general perspective and his democratic approach to things meant that the people had the voice, and that whatever came out of the elections ruled the country. But when we look at it today, the executive is very much limited by legislation. If you have 266 MPs, whether it's a coalition, it meant that the government in power controls the system. In the current system, there is no separation of powers in Turkey. When we look at the 12th of September coup participants, their approach was thus. There is a prime minister, there's two heads. There's a president and a prime minister, and the president was the leader of the coup. Then the titulary parliamentary system was started after the 1980 coup. So the president has wide powers, but despite all these powers, they're not responsible. In this constitution, the president, whatever crimes he commits or she commits, apart from treason, is not responsible politically. And in 1991, they decided that treason was not a crime anymore by the laws. So the president, whatever crimes he commits, is not responsible legally. In 2007, though, and this was talked about by a previous speaker, there was an election for the presidency, and the Constitutional Court, with the opposition, there was 367 MPs needed to participate, but until that, actually, that was not a necessity by law, by the Constitution. So there were two approaches after that. And AKP supported reforms in Turkey. They wanted to get the people to elect the president. This was offered into legislation, but the opposition and the people who are the status quo defenders that they were opposing the presidential system today, they didn't want the people to elect the president. They wanted the parliament to elect the president. But by the referendum, 70% of the Turkish people decided that the president will be elected by the people. Now, when we look at the president who is elected by the people, the system is lacking in the sense that the president is not responsible legally. This might cause crises within the system, and the system needs to become more transparent. If the people elect a president, then we cannot talk about the parliamentary system. If you look at the semi-presidential system in France, you can say it's similar. The system change, issue of the system change came thus. The people elect the president, but he has no legal responsibilities. This means that the people don't have a chance to audit him, and the change now means that the president will be responsible to the people. And the second issue is going to be that the two-headed system will disappear, so that the person that is elected by the people will be ruling the country. AKP, since its foundation, has supported reforms, and the last part of these reforms is going to be the constitutional reform referendum that will take place. And this is an important jumping point for Turkish democracy, we could say that. When we look at we started with the MHP, we came into an agreement with the MHP in the parliament. But when we look at the system in Turkey, the right of the people to have their voice come to realization, when we came together with CHP as well in the constitutional talks, we agreed on 7 points. And these 7 points will be part of the constitution. There will be 18 points that will be voted on. 15 of these are going to be, one of them is a temporary, and two of them are about executive. There are some issues for the law, for the just judicial system, and part of that is that judges and prosecutors commission is going to be they're going to be elected by the parliament. If we look at the democratization, when we look at civilian rule, isn't it that the military courts are going to be closed now. The parliament and the presidency, all of the judicial branches will be chosen by the parliament and the president, and the presence of two military personnel in that commission is going to be ended. If we look at right now in Turkey, there's no separation of power, there's unity of powers. If you have 267 MPs, it means that the parliament cannot, the opposition cannot control anything. And despite all the proposals in parliament, as long as you have majority, you cannot be opposed. Right now, the legislation is going to be completely separated from executive, and the judiciary will be completely independent and will be able to audit the other branches. And right now, if we look at the laws that are passed in parliament, they're almost 100% by the ruling party. None of the proposals that the MPs offer can be put into law because the legislation, the executive is ruling the legislation. One of the changes that's going to come along is going to be that right now, when we look at it, from 16th of April, it's going to be not going to be paid. It's going to be only MPs who can offer new laws. The president will be barred from doing this. The president's rule will only be to provide the executive role and act according to the legislation that comes out of the parliament. And the executive will be barred from being part of legislation. So the three branches will be independent. They will be responsible for their own role, and they will all depend on the public. So the president will not have any influence on legislation. He's not going to be able to influence this. He's not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to propose laws. The MPs, with their own free will bring new legislation to Parliament, and they will be able to audit. They will be able to influence and control, check the executive. Right now, the MPs don't have any function in checking on the executive because the government and the ministers, they cannot be audited by the parliament. But with the new changes that are proposed, the new powers of check will be this. One, that if the president says, the presidential decisions can be cancelled by the parliament. Also, if we look at other presidential decisions, the MPs can bring these decisions to the Constitutional Court. And another one is the Parliament will be able to have parliamentary research on presidential decisions, and they will be thus able to check on the decisions of the president. When we look at, we want written parliamentary questions that come along because this was only done orally beforehand, so we need to create a new check system, and that's what's proposed in this new constitution. Lastly, the budget will be prepared by the president, but the budget can only be agreed by the parliament, so the parliament gets that. And when we look at martial law and emergency powers, they will be decided by the parliament. When we look at emergency law, it says in the constitution that it's going to be asked to the parliament. But right now, there's laws that have not been presented to the parliament in the last 20, 30 years. The new proposal by the AKP and MHP says that the emergency powers demands for emergency powers have to be sent to the parliament on the same day that they're demanded. So there is not going to be, if there's going to be emergency powers, there's going to be a decision that's going to be taken on this, it has to be done on the same day. And this topic means that the president cannot, by their own choice, extend or ask for order an emergency powers. If the parliament agrees on it, there can be extension of emergency powers. One of the opposition's point of opposition is it's about questions in the parliament. There are problems that differ between a presidential and a parliamentary system. If we look at the presidential system, it means that the executive does not need the confirmation of the parliament, and it depends on the electorate. And every 5 years, it's the people who make the decisions. Thus, the limitations of executive versus legislation are going to be defined very clearly in this system. And if we look at the responsibilities, none of the motions by the president can be taken to court. There is no legal responsibility by the president. Whatever decision the president takes, you cannot take this to court. But from 16th of April, in the new reform, this is going to be cancelled by the AKP. So the presidential decisions will be subject to the legal system. And this is an important part of democratization. And when we look at emergency rule, military rule, there's going to be an end to that. If we look at legal, we talked about the lack of legal responsibility. What did we bring with the new reform package? The presidents, if they commit a crime, will be responsible. But currently, the only responsibility is points of treason. The referendum and the new reform brings that the president will be responsible for all sorts of crimes. And if the 75% of the MPs, right now 75% of the MPs could only bring the president to court, and that number is being brought down to 66%. This means that the president can be brought to court by only 66% of the MPs. Now, if we look at democratic reform on April 16, there are new changes, and the general approach was that there has been a titular parliamentary system in Turkey, and AKP wanted to end this since the day of its foundation. It promised to the electorate there will be a civilian constitution, but numbers that are necessary for this change were not there. But from FETÖ terror organization's coup attempt in 15th of July, the illegal formations within the government, within the state, had to be countered by a democratic reform, and this became part of the public discourse. When we look at the agreement with the MHP and AKP, this got presented to the public. In that day, we talked about Binali Yıldırım, our Prime Minister, made a call to CHP. What was it? They offered CHP to bring their own proposal. Propose your system based on a parliamentary system, and let us support this in the parliament. So as AKP, we would accept what CHP would be proposing, and we would propose a presidential system as an alternative. And they would be both accepted by the parliament, and they would be offered to the people. This is what we propose this in a very transparent manner. And in those days, 330 MPs within the parliament, the current constitution says 330 MPs need to decide to bring something to a referendum. If it's more than 367, it becomes law. As AKP, we said, even if we have more than 367 MPs, we want to take this issue to the public because a change in political structures need to be decided by the people. But despite our call to the CHP did not respond positively. As AKP, we would have liked them, we would have liked CHP to put in their inputs about the system change. But CHP's approach since the 2007 referendum has been that the president should not be elected by the people, it should be elected by the parliament. So the difference between AKP and CHP, one of the points was this. We look at the ones who oppose this reform package, we see that they are they defend the status quo, they're with the mentality of the coup that brought the current constitution into power. So they oppose AKP's reform initiatives. We can maybe talk about this in a more detailed manner, but when we look at the AKP's proposals, one of the main points is about separation of powers, and that the separation of powers are very clear, and the judiciary cannot be influenced by any sort of secret group or different branches. This is a very strong democratic proposal within these lines. And if I can, maybe I can talk about this more a little bit. Let me just say two more sentences. If we look at AKP, it's been in power for 15 years by itself. But when we look at the general approach of AKP, it's not based on people. It's based on, we think that it should be talked about as a system. Right now, Mr. Erdogan, President Mr. Erdogan, has no legal responsibility. His constitutional standing means that he has no legal responsibility. If this is not a democratic proposal, this proposal would not come along. Democracy's main principles mean that the system is based on the people, and the executive and the rulers and the government is chosen by the people. So if the people elect the government, they should be legally responsible. So separation of powers is necessary. It's going to be voted on. This is a democratic proposal, and this will mean that in Turkey there will be peace and consensus between different parts of the society. And the main reason is that the president will have to get more than 50% of the vote. And when we talked about the proposals, there were some proposals that said it should be just majoritarian. But right now, the package suggests that it has to be above 50%. Even if there's one candidate in the second round, if they don't get more than 50%, the reform suggests that there should be a re-election. And this is very transparent, and the reform will be voted on April 16th. Now, I want to ask a couple of things before I turn to our listeners. Before Nebi Bey said the parliamentary system could not bring solutions. Is the system change necessary? The problems that you mentioned, could they not come to a solution within the parliamentary systems? But when we look at the 1961 parliament and the post-1980s, after the military coup, the 1982 constitution, the political system created a governability problem. If we look at different rules that came along and legislation that came, the preventing political crises suggested that the political parties and their weaknesses needed to be prevented to create some sort of stability. And the election systems kept changing, and there have been 8 different changes, 8 times, and when they changed the system, the main motivation was in 1970 and 1980, when we look at the government crisis, the actors that ask themselves, can we make the future coalition systems, the weakness created by coalition systems, how can we prevent this, they asked themselves. And the first thing they thought about was, by changing the election rules, they wanted to rationalize the parliamentary system, or at least they wanted to surpass its crises. The second point was, especially when you look at the Turkish political system, they always came around to the point of presidential elections. In the second part of the 1970s, there has been arguments about the election of the president by the people. From 1970s to, well, I could say 2014, when we look at the period, in Turkey, the parties that were part of the democratic bloc asked for the direct election of the president by the people. This was a democratic demand within the parliamentary system. For example, if we look at the 1980 coup, or the processes that came beforehand, there was 115 attempts to choose a president. And when we look at the 1982 constitution, there were many commissions for the constitution. And when we look at the commissions, all the proposals for rationalization of the system, one of the main points was the election of the president by the people. But unfortunately, if we look at the ideological approach to the presidency as a guarantor of the system in Turkey, meant that if the people elect the president, then the elites and the tutelary powers within the system would lose their power on the system. So the election of the president by the people was constantly delayed. Especially when we look at 1983 on, you look at the Motherland Party and Turgut Özal that came to power in a strong way, they kept this question alive. And when they discussed this, there were two ways to discuss this. It was either to get the people to elect the president directly, or that the system would be completely transformed and it would become a presidential system. Because a presidential system would mean that the system by itself, the arguments within the system would disappear. What Özal argued for these, the opposition parties talked about personalities, talked about Özal's government, and because it was Özal, they argued that Özal wanted to change the system for his own rule, for his own government. They wanted to oppose these proposals in that period. If we look at the biggest opposition to Özal was Mr. Demirel. Mr. Demirel himself, when he became president in 1997, on the fourth year of his presidency, he said, I've been a president for 4 years. I had to confirm 6 different governments. So the system currently does not work. And because we cannot have a functional system right now, we need a transformation. So all of the parliamentary proposals are not working. This is what he declared. If we look at it more generally, if we look at if we leave the previous constitutions aside, the 1982 constitution up to today had 18 different changes. When we look at these 18 large reforms, if we look at the 108 points of the constitution today, 108 points have been changed. But furthermore, in 2007, especially when we look at the opposition, how the opposition created instability in the system, and that period the tutelary powers were strong. If we look at Abdulhamid's presidency, when it was voted, the night that it was voted, the chief of staff of the military made a declaration against the civilian government, and he sabotaged the civilian election of the president. And when we look at this crisis, when we look at a solution that was that the president should be elected by the people, and that it was agreed upon by the people, by the 68% of the electorate. This was a triumph for democracy, and this gain, democratic gain, when we look at current president Mr. Erdogan, has been going on. There is an elected president. Within a parliamentary system, if we look at all the approaches to all the different proposals of rationalization of the system, a solution has not been reached. And secondly, from 1970s on, when we look at the presidential election by the electorate, now that it's been agreed upon by more than 60% of the people, this can be seen as a democratic gain. If we look at these 2 points together, we can say that the president's influence in parliamentary systems, usually the presidents are a symbolic position, but in Turkey the symbolism has been exceeded because the president has large powers. So when we look at it, the position of the presidents, it's hard to transform this back into a regular parliamentary system because the president is directly elected by the people. So when we look at all this framework, in Turkey, the system needs to, all other proposals other than evolution into a presidential system only mean that new arguments and new crises will come along. Thank you. Mr. Abdulhamit, you talked about different separation of powers, and we look at worries about the referendum, and we look at the people who support the no side. There's a few points about separation of powers. One of them is about the timing and the renewal of elections. There has been many points made about this. And secondly is the presidential decisions. We talked about separation of powers, but we want to talk about those 2 points that are part of the public discussion. If we look at the presidential decisions and all the arguments about how powers will be around only one person, these are important points. But if we look at the opposition, one of the opposition's points is that the parliament can be annulled. If we look at the package on 16th of April, one of the important reforms is all of the elections, the presidential and the parliamentary elections, are going to be on the same day. But the main reason for this, especially if we look at the government and the parliament, the possible crisis between them needs to be prevented. This is why it was proposed. So if there's a problem between the government and the parliament, we need to make sure that effects are not on society in economic and political ways and social ways. So the cohabitation, to prevent cohabitation sort of situations, this was decided as such. Every elections will happen every 5 years, but if there are no elections within 5 years, how do you solve a potential crisis? So a year after the election, there's a problem between the government and the parliament. If there is such a situation, there will be a crisis, and these crises will need to be tolerated by all sides by 4 years. This was the formula that was proposed. If the president or the parliament, if there is a need, they can cancel their own powers, they can renew elections. And one of the most important reform points is this. The main reason for this is to provide control and balance. If there's a crisis within the system, this needs to be balanced. And thirdly, if there's a crisis, the people will function as the referee to get through the crisis. One of the opposition points here is that the president can annul the parliament. They've been manipulating this point. But if we look at the current point, if we look at it, the president can annul the parliament if the parliament cannot form a government, cannot get a vote of confidence, just like other parliamentary systems. The reasons for each parliamentary system can change. The president decides to call for elections, but he can stay in his power. But in the new package, if the president proposes an election, that means the president's position is also cancelled. Thus, if there needs to be a very big crisis to happen for the president to take this decision, we're talking about a system that will prevent a personal rule. The April 16th proposal will prevent a one-man rule. How? In the current system, the executive, one of the main points of executive is the prime minister. The prime minister also assigns governors. He's the head of the party. They're the head of the party. But there are no term limits. But if we look at President Erdogan himself was a prime minister for 11 years. But the current proposal suggests that because executive and the presidency and all of them are unified, they are limited to 2 terms. 5 plus 5 is the maximum of 10 years. So the president cannot take part of any executive power for more than 2 terms. If there's a crisis, if the parliament makes a decision, and let's say 1 year later, after the election, there's a crisis. Although they have a 4-year term left, they can call for elections. It acts like they have used the 5 years, whether they are 6 months in or 4 years in. In the second term after this, if they can get elected again, if they call for elections again, the Constitution suggests that the current president cannot be a candidate again. 2-3 days ago, the opposition party said that they could be elected by a second time. We have English translations of this. None of the parts of the constitutional proposal suggest this. Just one exception: if there's a 3/5 majority in parliament in the second term of the presidency, if the president decides to call elections, then they can be a candidate again. And the main reason behind this is to suggest that if they call for president's elections a couple of times, instead of 10 years, they could be out of the system within just 2 years. So that's a risk. To prevent this risk, if there's 3/5 majority in the parliament, they can run for presidency again. We decided with the MHP, along with the MHP, we decided on 3/5, because right now, you can think this: the presidency, if their party can get 3/5, but 3/5 is a large majority. And if they cannot reach this majority, then the president will not be able to run again. And this is a check system. It's a check on the system. Another topic is the presidential decisions. When we look at presidential decisions, they don't act as law. If we look at the proposal, they are limited. They cannot take any decisions on the judiciary or the legislation. Only on executive they can have presidential decisions. If you look at the current constitution, though, the president's decisions act as law. There's presidential decisions that act as laws. They can repeal laws. They can do many things. If we look at the democratic proposal on the 16th of April, the president is limited to executive decisions. Citizenship rights, individual rights cannot be made. Or look at property rights, right to move, science, arts, anything that relates to the individual. President cannot make a decision. Despite this, if we look at property laws, they say that property rights can be. This is not right. The president cannot make a decision on property rights. New taxation creating new judiciary. It's not possible. Another limit is that if we look at if if the presidency and if the let's say taxation in the constitution, the taxation is given to the parliament as a power. The president will not be able to make any decisions on this. There's about 100 parts that are part of the executive. For example, universities. Universities are part of government. And if we look at the constitution, because there needs to be laws that needs to be passed about the university, the president will not be able to open or close universities. This is another limitation. Is that enough? No, another limitation is in the laws. If we look, the president can have presidential decrees. Let's say I want to make a change in this way. As if a president has a decree, is that enough? Another limitation is if the presidential decrees clash with the laws, the laws are followed. The presidential decrees cannot be law. Another limitation, if the parliament makes legislation about the same topic, the presidential decree is annulled. If there's an opportunity and there's a new decree by the president, but the parliament thinks otherwise, then the presidential decision becomes ineffective. Let's go above that, and the parliament, the president, it's possible to do this numerically, and the presidential decree could not be annulled. Is that there's not going to be any checks on it? No, with the proposal, the parliament, the first and the second party, and with 120 MPs, they can take the decree to the Constitutional Court to annul the presidential decree. So there's a parliamentary check on it, and second, there's a judiciary check on it. And the constitutionally, the limitation will be there. If we look at, if the decree is about the citizens, if it's unconstitutional, that citizen will be able to go to Constitutional Court for annulling the presidential decree. So there's another suggestion. They say the judiciary will be selected by the presidency. There's not enough separation of powers. Let me say a few words about this. If you look at the current constitution, the Judges and Prosecutors High Commission is formed thus. The President selects 4 members, the others are elected. How many is that? There's 22 members. The judges themselves choose the rest of the members. We change this thus. The President will again assign 4 members. And we wouldn't even bring this if the people didn't elect the President. We want to, as AKP, because the President is someone elected by the people, if he makes a bad decision, they will pay. If they make a bad decision, they will pay for it in the elections. 7 members will be assigned by the Parliament. Where did we take this power out of? Right now, the judges and the prosecutors chose the members themselves. We took that because we want to prevent a state governed by the judiciary. We took that from them, and we wanted to get indirect legitimacy of the people through the Parliament. The majority will be chosen by the Parliament, and a few by the President. The opposition suggests this very often, but if the MPs, you have the majority in the MPs in the Parliament, so you are hurting the independence of the judiciary. I want to respond to it in this way. First of all, in democracy. Today, the AKP wins. Tomorrow, the main opposition might be in government. Democracy allows for this. It's to create a social consensus. This is why we support democracy. And we want Turkey to be more democratic. We are proposing reforms for this. If we look at Mr. Erdogan as a politician, physically cannot be he's not a creature that can go on forever, but the system matters. But if we look at the suggestions of the opposition, let's say they say you are choosing it. If we look at the election, after 30 days, there's going to be an election. How is the parliament going to choose? They need a two-thirds majority. And does the AKP has two-thirds majority in parliament? No. In the second round, it goes down to 3/5 for the Judges and Prosecutors Commission. And 3 out of 5, AKP doesn't have this. Finally, in the third round, it needs a simple majority. But if we sit with MHP, we decided to help democracy develop in Turkey. In the third round, the main two members who got the most votes, there will be a lottery to choose which one becomes a member. So this is a very democratic system that will allow for the judiciary. There is the members of the Judges and Prosecutors Commission cannot be changed. After this reform is passed, the president will not be able to make any changes to the commission. Right now, the president assigns certain members. There are members that the previous presidents have proposed. For the last 3 presidents have assigned members to the commission. These are 12-year position, and whenever their term ends, the president will assign new ones. So there's the military courts, the 2 military members assigned by them. Once their term ends, apart from that change that the military will not assign people, there are no changes. There's a separation of powers. It's a democratic constitutional change. Thank you. I have other questions, but if you want, our listeners can have some questions here. We can give them a microphone.
Michael Kilic, who retired from the Department of Agriculture.
Altı. 5 Türkçe. 5 Türkçe.
Thank you very much. Michael Kilic worked on Turkey in the Department of Agriculture for many, many years. I'm listening to what you were saying, and you're talking about the people have the power and the people will talk. What we hear here and what I read in the press also is that the people don't have the power. Now the free speech seems to have disappeared. Freedom of the press seems to have disappeared. You criticize the current government over there, you end up in jail or something like that. How can you have such a fair election? And second of all, something I told the principal advisor to Mr. Erdogan about 5 years ago, that clearly he doesn't believe what's written here in the Jefferson Memorial. I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And that seems to have disappeared in Turkey. And I'm very sorry to see that. And how can you have such an election if you have these circumstances? Thank you very much. Hoş geldiniz.
Hangi durumda? Siz hangi durumsunuz? Evet.
In Turkey, if we look at freedom of speech or freedom of the press, the allegations that these don't exist, we cannot accept these allegations. In Turkey, all parts can have their own propaganda. If you look at the referendum, right now the process, freely the people who support the no vote, they can defend themselves across the country. They have a campaign, and freely they can express their opinions. A few days ago, our president went into a tent that was supporting the no vote, and he wished them well, and they talked. In Turkey, if we look at this matter, the manipulations from outside the country are wrong, and our president, Mr. Erdogan, has always defended freedom of speech and improved on it by legislation, expanded the rights, and himself was thrown into prison for reading a poem. He's a political leader who suffered this. Thus, in Turkey, Turkey is a free country, and it nobody's wronged for expressing their opinions, especially after 15th of July. If you look at the FETA terror organizations, this is their manipulation. This is their manipulation. If we look at the 15th of July, the FETA terror organization, they are manipulating these affairs. The Turkish Republic has been an effective country fighting Daesh. As a Gaziantep MP myself, look at Frat Shields operation fighting Daesh. We see the martyred soldiers, and we are a city that lives on the Syrian border. As Turkey, our fight against Daesh, our soldiers have lost their lives, young citizens, and despite this, in the media, Turkey's fight with Daesh is manipulated upon. We see this, but if we look at the reality, Turkey is not only fighting terrorism that threatens humanity as a whole, it's a country that fights it. And apart from that, when we look at the freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, when we look at the freedom of the press, for all parts who are not part of any terrorist movements, their rights will not be limited. We have to say this. Thank you. I want to say welcome, first of all, and thank you for the information you provided. If we look at the referendum process in Turkey, there's a lot of arguments about it. People sleep and wake up with the referendum. For us, even if the Turks here are going to vote on it, they are watching this from a distance. And if we look at the US, the Americans that follow the events, they don't follow it as closely as people in Turkey. I want to ask you crudely, do you have a presidential system in the US? And there's the proposal in Turkey is different than it's an evolution from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. If we look at the American presidential system, can you talk about can you compare and contrast the two systems? What is proposed in Turkey versus what exists in the US? The presidential system, if we look at the framework of this in Turkey, we can reach a conclusion. If we look at the proposal, you can evaluate it as such. The political systems in the world and the rationalization of these systems across the world, there are two main points that are focused on. What are these two things? And even from 1958 in France, which turned into a semi-presidential system, or you can look at other rationalized government systems in the world. First of all, in Turkey, there's 140 years of parliamentary tradition in Turkey, and within this parliamentary tradition, there's problems of democracy, there's political crises, and the political crises. To overcome these political crises, different political traditions and political parties have proposed different things. For example, if we look at from 1980s on, in the parliamentary system in Turkey, it has been proposed that some parties have proposed that this should change into a presidential system. Many of these did not just discuss this, but they actually studied how these can be, how a framework can be prepared to prevent political crises and instabilities. There have been proposals. There have been proposals for a constitutional change. So in Turkey, if we look at the transformation of the system, we have to, the goal is to prevent political crises that took place before. AKP and MHP are talking about this. And secondly, the new system, to prevent such crises again, the question becomes, how do you create a framework for this goal? Just like Mr. Abdulhamit talked about the timing of the elections, and whenever the system gets stuck, for example, in 2007, that there isn't enough MPs, so 367 people in the parliament, this was an artificial crisis. The previous presidents were elected with less of a decorum, but that was an artificial crisis created by the elites groups of titular parliamentary system in Turkey. They actually put pressure on the constitutional court, and that hurt the governance in Turkey. So prevent such crises in Turkey, when you look at the political experiences, you have to create a new framework. And the second point is, in this process, is if we look at the discussions in Turkey about the proposed changes of a presidential system, if we look at this presidential system, to look at previous presidential system, you have to look at the crises in these systems and what kind of discussions took place to prevent these crises. And then can you give an example to this? For example, in the US system, I'm sure our listeners are more aware of this. If we look at when the parties come, when the political traditions are different on the parliamentary side and the presidential side, it locks up the political system. Solutions cannot be. How do you create solutions becomes a question. In Turkish political tradition, the parties, when they elect strong leaders, the parties of the center, apart from the parties of the center, there's sort of this solution. There's too much. If you look at the tradition in Turkey, when you look at the party structures, it's fractured, and there's a lot of changing of parties. There's instability within the system. When you look at all these structures and the crises that came along, to prevent these, the center of the system needs to be strong, and the political parties should not be fragmented and affect the system. So to prevent this, when we look at the presidential system, the 50% issue becomes important, and that the elections are taking place at the same place, and that elections will be renewed, both the presidential and parliamentary elections will be at the same time renewed. These sort of mechanisms are actually part of the rationalization. Lastly, I can add this regarding this question. Of course, in Turkey, there's a governance system, and in time, this political sociology of the system, following the political sociology of the system, there will be crises, there will be problems. And to surpass these problems, the parliaments, with the support of the people, will try to ameliorate, improve things. But if you look at the Turkish parliamentary system, and considering the crisis and the titulary nature of the regime, we need a point of comparison. Today's AKP, with their agreement with MHP, the proposal of the presidential system should be, when we look at the parliamentary system that was proposed as a framework by the military junta in 1982, there needs to be a comparison between these two things. And which one, we need to ask which one helps the deepening of the democracy, institutionalization of the democracy. The comparison must be made. as an academic or a member of a think tank, I think about these things. The current political system, the framework of the system, is a result of a coup constitution. But the proposals will improve on these. Well, this is what I'm trying to propose. This is what I'm saying. In Turkey, the fact that democracy is not improved and deepened in Turkey, and that there's a military coup every 10 years, that this are possible. The reason this was possible was because the politics was weak. Political structures were weak, they were fragmented, and the coalition periods are part of this. There are 6 coups in Turkey, 4 of them were successful, and when we look at the successful coups and the periods around it, it's all around coalition periods or that periods that were a political crisis. In 2007, when the internet declaration, military declaration, and in 2016, the coup attempt by the SETA terrorist organization that killed 240 people and injured thousands, a very important coup attempt. If this was unsuccessful, the result, the reason why this failed was because the center of the government, political system was strong. Apart from Mr. Erdogan today, if there was a weak government and weak leadership, the July 15 Fethullah coup attempt could have a more chance of success. Because Turkish political culture, if you look at all the coup attempts, the Fethullah terror organization has benefited from these. If you look at, they read the declaration on national television, how they talked about how they will declare emergency powers, and that intended to end the elected government. And we saw this was a coup that tried to do this. So, if we look at it, if we want to make the center stronger of the political system in Turkey, in the processes that will take place in the future, it should not depend on charismatic leaders. It should be within the constitutional framework, and what it allows, the political system should mean that a general population should not have to face these issues anymore. Do you want to talk about the U.S. part? And there too, they have a direct election of the president, the vice presidents. They get assigned after the presidential elections. If the president is not there anymore, the vice president has to call for elections in 45 days. There will be direct election of the president by the people. I can just give you the general framework is that. Let me get one more question. We have about 5 minutes left. We talked about, there was a question about whether the president can cancel the parliament. From what I understand, that Abdulhamit Bey, I'm asking you in response to your answer to that, the president can cancel the parliament. Is that right? No, they can't cancel. Here's the proposal. The president or the parliament, both of them, they have a right to renew elections. Cancellation is with the current constitution. In the current constitution, if the government cannot be formed or get a vote of confidence, the president can call for elections, cancel parliament, annul the parliament, and go for elections. But the president's own power goes on. He keeps his position. But in the proposed system, the president, if they decide to call for elections, that will mean that their own role will end. They go to elections together. The current parliamentary system means parliament can be annulled, but the proposal that we propose, the parliament cannot be annulled. Both organs, both the presidency and the parliament, will end their term and go for elections, deciding a new term. Thank you. This, I want to just point out about this annulling the parliament. This is a technical argument. When you look at constitutional arguments, annulling, this is from the British parliamentary system, the kings could end the parliament's term. That's the parliamentary tradition. Now, if we look at Latin America, we look at presidential systems, it can be done in a one-sided way, but the Turkey's current system, the term limits on the parliament or the presidency, it's not going to be one-sided. If you want to call it annulling the parliament, you have to define it else in another way. It should be mutual, annulling it mutually. This is how it's going to be. This is how you have to define it. It won't be one-sided. The argument here is more of a constitutional theory argument. Thank you. I want to ask one last question, then we're going to end the program. If yes is the answer in the referendum, what will be the process? What will be the transition period? If we look at the proposals, it relates to executive with 18 points, but the parties and election laws and presidential election rules, there's some necessities that the system will require. So if we look at the issues around this, from the election system to political party system and the change in elections, the Constitution will not define this. It will be defined by the election rules. So the reform package, there was one addition to it. If after the referendum is accepted, within 6 months, all adaptive rules will need to be passed. And after that, after the constitutional changes accepted, there will need to be consensus. There will need to be work on consensus, and necessary changes will have to follow, because a governmental system change requires an adaptation period, both for laws and regulations, on both sides of the society and the parliaments. These are important for a democratic transition. This will be provided. Let me add one last thing. Let me say, President Erdogan, the head of our party, called for something. He asked for all different political parties to talk together and let's reach a consensus on these issues. But the political parties in the parliaments did not provide an answer after the June elections, before the June elections. So in the future, such work will be done, possibly. One thing has to be pointed out: this reform package will look at. This will mean that the people will have more direct representation. It is structured in this way. AKP and Mr. Erdogan, President Erdogan, will not use any powers that are not given to them by the people. If we look at today, if there's a change in the system, if there's a change on what the electors change, someone else, this will be respected. Allegations of dictatorship and one-man rule, this is a result of all the tutelary parliamentary parties. This is their words. The people have no problems. These governments, this politician is chosen by the people. They're not the result of a military coup. They cannot be called a dictator. And this is how the Turkish people approach this issue. Turkey respects the electorate's choices. And if we look at, we got 41% in June, and there was we couldn't form a government, and we respected the result of the election. In AKP, if we look at, it's a reformist party. It proposes changes. The parts that oppose the proposal of the constitution, they are the remnants of a titular regime. And if we look at this approach by Mr. Erdogan, This defends nothing but democracy, and it will defend nothing else. And the democratic developments around the world, the AKP will be the defender of these and a participant of these developments. The opposition is anti-democratic, they're titulary, and they are the part that cannot win by election, and they are the understanding, they're the creation of an understanding that comes to power through military coups, and the people will make the final rule on these issues, and the final results will be respected, of course, by us, as usual. I want to add one couple of things. The referendum or the constitutional change, the two important points for me are these. The following process from now on, the presidents will have to be elected for more than 50%. This is one point. And secondly is the 5+5 two-term limit. In Turkish political culture, what we know is the political parties, if you look at the tradition, leaders of political parties stay for a long time. This will prevent that. And secondly, the 50% requirements will strengthen the center of politics in Turkey. The 50% means that candidates has to embrace large sections of the population. They have to be moderate, and that they have to, those who do not embrace large sections of the populace will not be elected. Let me add one more thing for our American friends. In Turkey, one of the points is that the leader of a party is going to be the leader of a party and a president, and there's some opposition to that. But if we look at the legislation we propose, after 1961 Constitution, the president's ties to the party were cut. The change that is brought just removes this statement. If they can choose to remove their link to the political party or not. They can be apolitical or political. That's the choice. Thank you. I just want to add to that. Thank you. I want to thank you all. You took some time from your busy program in Turkey. You just came for one day, and I wanted to ask Nebi Bey also. Thank you for